Jane asked me to talk about autism and vaccinations. A mentor of mine long ago when I was a student advised me that if you enter a new field you don't know anything about, you should not read anything about it. Don't read the literature, don't read anything, so that you can approach it in an original way before you're led down the paths that the people that are already in the field know. But if you give a talk about it, you should read all the literature because you don't want to make any mistakes. I haven't read all of this literature, but I want to share with you why I have an opinion about the autism and vaccinations. Long ago in La Jolla, I was working, and I had a research laboratory that could make peptides. Peptides are small proteins. Proteins are made of 20 amino acids, and they're hooked together in chains. And the chains get to be 100 or 200 or 300 long. Each of the 20 amino acids has a special chemical function. And it has been found you can build a living thing this way because you can make a molecule that will do anything. It can support your bones, or be your hair and fingernails, or catalyze any of the 1,000 reactions that are needed in your body. DNA is just a library about how to make proteins. And there are these long chains, and then in water, water may be a little different than I thought yesterday, but in any case, then in water they kind of roll up and form unique structures, and then they do the things that they're supposed to do. But they're also used, and that's long ones, those are proteins. But they come also in sizes of 8 to 10, which serve as hormones. As you add amino acids, they become more unique, but apparently it's been found that in designing these things that you have to get to 8 or 10 amino acids before it has a unique structure to do something. So for example, the hormone oxytocin is 8 amino acids long. Well, I was fortunate to work with a man who invented the procedure for being able to make these things easily, Dr. Bruce Merrifield in New York. And he had taught me this as a student. I'm a young faculty member in La Jolla. And over at the Salk Institute, there was a guy named Ed Eiler who was working on something called experimental allergic encephalomyelitis. And we were working on various things, but I also knew a man named Bernie Rimland. Rimland had an autistic son, and this had led him to be interested in this. And he had become America's greatest expert on autism. It was a rare disease, afflicted about 1 child in 5,000. And he was trying to find empirically some way of helping these children. And one of the things he did, he formed an organization where all the parents with autistic children joined the organization. And they sent them questionnaires with a list of substances that, have you tried any of these on your child, and did they get better, worse, or be the same? I think he had 2 stages of better, 2 stages of worse, and the same. And he did these surveys. And that was the best medicine that was being done on autism, his surveys, which he published. And the surveys were remarkable because they tried everything. For example, there were DNA-killing cancer drugs on there that they were giving to autistic children. Anything. And his surveys then were passed out to parents, and they could look at the ones that had the greatest probability and try giving them to their autistic children. And so I learned about autism then, and we were thinking we'd do some experiments on metabolic profiling on autism, but we never got them done. But it was a very rare disease. Over at the Salk Institute, there was a guy named Ed Eiler, and Eiler was working with Salk. They were working on a disease called allergic encephalomyelitis. And simply put, if you grind up your brain, or the brain of a human, and inject it into a guinea pig, nothing will happen. But if you inject it with an adjuvant, the guinea pig will be dead in a day or 2. If you take the guinea pig's brain, grind it up, inject it into you, nothing will happen. Inject it with an adjuvant, that's another something that goes with it, you'll be dead. And it causes, and is used as a model for studying autoimmune disease. The adjuvant is something that the system reacts to that makes it thousands of times more reactive to the antigen. The antigen, you see, you put in something, maybe if it's a virus you're trying to protect against, you may try to, well, virus, if it was a bacteria you want to protect against, you would put in something that looked enough like the bacteria that it would be recognized by your immune system, but your immune system won't recognize it, and your immune system has to then build an ability to recognize this thing. You give it the thing you want to recognize, which will attack the thing that you want to protect against, and so on. But when you put it in, it isn't enough. You have to put in an adjuvant that causes a tremendous reaction and causes the immune system to build the immunity that's necessary. And it's thousands of fold greater than you get without an adjuvant. So he was doing this work, and he had taken the protein, which it turns out he isolated it. They'd gone down, they found there was a particular protein in this in the brain that had on its surface a series of amino acids with a structure, and that structure was the same for people and guinea pigs and rabbits and so forth. And so if you injected that with an adjuvant, you became immune to your own protein. It was a protein in the nervous system. You attacked your own immune system and you died. It's an autoimmune disease. And a vicious one, but it was used as a model. They were studying immune disease. And so Euler had the protein, and then he broke it up in pieces with digestive enzymes, the same ones that digest the things in your stomach, and got a lot of little peptides, pieces of it, and then sorted through those until he found the 10 residue sequence that would do the same thing. If you injected the sequence that was this little piece of the protein that the immunity was developed against, the same thing would happen. It killed the guinea pig if you put it in with an adjuvant. So he took that sequence and he determined the order of the amino acids and which ones, so that he knew its structure, its primary structure. And then he came to my lab because we could make these things, and he said, would you make this? If you make this and I inject it in the guinea pigs and they die, that's proof that the whole thing is kosher. So I gave it to one of my graduate students, Fred Westall, and he went to work making the peptide. It turned out to be a very difficult one to make, so Fred was at it for several months. But he finally got the peptide and gave it to Euler. He injected it in the guinea pigs and nothing happened. It didn't work. Well, in those days, this kind of chemistry was difficult to do. Protein sequencing was partly science, partly art, and they'd sequenced it wrong. So he found the sequence in error and he fixed it. Fred made the peptide, injected it, killed the guinea pigs. And an interesting sidelight related to the government, it used to be, if you read a scientific paper from, say, 50 years ago, it makes you happy. I mean, you read it, the guy's got a premise, he does some work, then he thinks of things that might affect the work, and he does those, and by the time you're done, every question you're asking in the first part, you find answered in the last part. Because people worked for 2 or 3, 4 years before they published. And then they published really good things. But today, to get research grants, you have to publish your diary. If you're on government money, you're publishing your diary. And as a consequence, Euler had published the sequence before we did the work, and it was wrong. And later I met people from 2 other laboratories that did this whole thing, and because they based it on his sequence, all their work failed, because he had to publish his diary. Anyway, the situation is that if you put in the antigen, the thing that will stimulate the immunity, alone, it doesn't work. You have an adjuvant that sharply accelerates the response of the organism. Well, now, a young person, a baby or a young child's immune system is just developing. And it is figuring out what is it and what is not it. And so you can imagine that if you put an adjuvant into a small child, it will stimulate a huge immune response. And it could stimulate that response against some of the things in the child, too, that it hasn't yet cataloged. So it seems to me that turning on the immune system 1,000-fold in a little kid whose body is still trying to figure out what is going on could be harmful and maybe cause this problem. When I first learned that autism was growing in incidence, I thought, well, maybe the doctors are diagnosing too much and so forth. But now, as you saw in that slide in an earlier presentation, it's 100-fold higher. It was 1 in 5,000, now it's 1 in 50. So it is obvious that something is being done to cause this disease. Correlation doesn't prove causality, so because we're vaccinating and because we have autism growing at a tremendous rate, that doesn't prove that they are related. I noticed that there was a big fight over the mercury in the adjuvant. Well, mercury is toxic, but I'd be a little surprised if the pharmaceutical companies were so foolish as to put mercury in quantities that would be expected to be harmful. But I'd be most concerned about the adjuvant itself. Now, if you don't have an adjuvant, you have a much more expensive problem, because if you want to cause immunity, you will have to hit the organism again and again and again. It might be a course of 3 or 4 shots to get immunity without using an adjuvant. But to put an adjuvant into a young child reminds me of what happened with the guinea pigs and the things in the experiments I've described to you. I don't know whether anyone knows whether the vaccines are causing autism, but with these adjuvants in there, I think the best policy is to vaccinate children, if you have to, as late as possible. And we are interested in these things because they're academic, but we're mainly interested in them because how they affect ourselves and our children and our grandchildren. And the policy we always followed was to, if we felt we had to have a vaccination, we did it as late as possible in life. If you're going to some schools, the child can't get in because he's not vaccinated, so you may have to do that. And then, of course, as that speaker pointed out, it's crazy to do vaccinations for anything that isn't dangerous and therefore justifying the risk. That's about all I know about this subject. Right? But I think from those experiences in La Jolla that the idea of injecting adjuvants into young children is nuts, because it just turns their immune system on 1,000-fold. It's popular in science to say that something increases the immune system. You see it all over, you read the health food literature, this is good for your immune system and so forth. And I worked for a long time with a guy named Linus Pauling, who became sort of excited about vitamin C. At first he was correctly excited, then he got sort of overexcited. But he was saying that vitamin C stimulates the immune system. And finally, he convinced a very fine professor at Stanford to test this in rabbits. This guy really knew about immune systems in rabbits. And so he injected stuff in the rabbits, and sure enough, the immune system reacted sharply and grew. But it reacted for the same reason that ionizing radiation increases the immune system. We're talking about this whole body radiation. It probably works in part by stimulating your immune response, your protective response against the disease that's attacking you. And of course, ionizing radiation can't have some kind of clever biochemical value. This is a very high-powered thing going through the body, and it hits. If it happens to hit something, it'll break the molecules, ionize them, produce free radicals, and so on. So the ionizing radiation that helps, obviously, in whole body radiation in these diseases and other things, cannot have any positive biochemical effect directly, but it breaks things. And when it breaks things, that causes a lot of things that are not supposed to be there, and the immune system can just react to try to protect itself from all the garbage that has been produced. And in the case of vitamin C, to Pauling's displeasure, that's what was happening too. Vitamin C, in the presence of oxygen, reacts to produce free radicals and peroxides. So if you put a lot of vitamin C in the system, the free radicals and peroxides produced are very similar to what ionizing radiation produces. And the rabbit got all kinds of pieces, and the pieces were reacted by the immune system, and the immune system was activated by the same means. We discovered that when a grad student in La Jolla, I was working with Pauling, and we were all taking megavitamins and playing with ourselves and doing experiments on ourselves. And so I was running a lab at Stanford with him and then the one in La Jolla, and I said to one of the graduate students that, why don't you just do megavitamin therapy on all our deamidation reactions, see what it does. These are reactions where we study molecular clocks and proteins. And he wouldn't do it. He thought I was nuts. But I convinced another graduate student, and she put large amounts of vitamins in with our, these were peptide experiments, and none of them had any effect except vitamin C, a tremendous effect. And the tools, again, were primitive. We were looking for a charge change in these little peptides as we deamidated them, and the charge change occurred. And it's the worst paper I ever wrote, probably the worst, only experiment, really bad error I made. I published this in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, that vitamin C accelerated deamidation because the charge change was the same, and it was, we were watching it. But that wasn't what was happening. Vitamin C was breaking the molecule in a different way, which also led to the same charge change. And then we took a protein transferrin. It's a nice, big, beautiful protein, and you put it in a buffer solution. That's a solution with the same, with carefully controlled pH and everything. You put this nice protein in there, and if you leave it overnight, you come back, it's still there. If you put vitamin C in it, when you come back in the morning, it'll just be fragments, a whole bunch of pieces, because vitamin C will react with oxygen, and the free radicals and peroxides will tear the protein to pieces. Now, but if you leave the oxygen out, you deaerate the solution before you leave it overnight, nothing will happen. So it's odd that vitamin C is considered an antioxidant, because it is, in the presence of air in our bodies, it makes huge amounts of free radicals and peroxides. And those do the same thing. They stimulate the immune system by breaking macromolecules and other living molecules, and then your immune system reacts to them. That's about all I know on this subject. And I've already floated into another part. Now, these days I like to make political speeches. And I was a very good boy. I left the Trump signs in the car. Because I do my usual work, and then on Saturdays I go to parades and fairs and stuff, and talk to people about those things. And I'm willing to talk about anything. If anybody has a specific question, you know, I've talked with you about many things. You've heard all these wonderful lectures. But I've told you all I know about, which is only the thoughts that I had. This? Oh, you want to? Yeah.
Well, since
Yeah.
Since Jane Orion started this whole question, I wanted to ask Jane a question. As best I recall, she discovered that the rotavirus vaccine actually caused intussusception, unlike what some of the studies claim to show. This was some years ago. Do you remember it, or how badly do you have an update on what's happened since that discovery was made? As I remember it, the rotavirus was recalled because of your work. And what's happened since then?
Well, it wasn't really my work. There were a number of clinicians who noticed that babies who were given the rotavirus, which is protecting against infantile diarrhea, which of course is a huge cause of infant death, especially in the third world, that they were having a higher than normal incidence of intussusception. And the CDC was really quite stonewalling on this issue. One of the things that I suggested on the listservs that were discussing this is that you shouldn't just look at the absolute incidence of intussusception, which is where the intestine telescopes in itself, and it can cause strangulation and necrosis and death. You should look at the time interval between vaccine and intussusception and see if in that interval after the vaccine you have a higher incidence than before, and which is true that you do. And the CDC knew this, and we filed a FOIA request to find out the emails and the other communications concerning this data, and there were people who were saying, oh, we're really in trouble if people find this out. well, eventually it was found out, that particular rotavirus vaccine was withdrawn, at least in the United States. It may still be given to children in the third world, where it may have a greater benefit to risk ratio because the children are more likely to die of diarrhea. There still is a rotavirus vaccine. It's a different one than that. One of the big proponents of mandatory vaccination for everything, Paul Offit, who has written a lot of books about it and is very insulting toward people like me that he will call an anti-vax quack just for suggesting that maybe vaccines, like every other medical intervention, have a risk-benefit ratio, and it may differ with the individual patient, it may differ with the circumstances, and one ought to take all of these things into consideration instead of just vaccinating everybody for everything. Well, Paul Offit happens to have a patent on a rotavirus vaccine, a different one of the ones that was not withdrawn. So that's all I know about that. But I did want to ask Art if perhaps he would elaborate a little bit from people on what an adjuvant is. Some of us would like a little refresher on that.
Today it's a special substance that they make. You know, when we were doing those experiments, we used Freund's adjuvant, which is just mineral oil with some broken bacteria in it. That's what was used in those days as an adjuvant. Today they have special chemicals they've made as adjuvants. Freund's is not allowed because it has apparently some side effects. So the adjuvants are compounds that have been found to do that to the immune system. I think there are several kinds. Doesn't matter, it's what they do. This business of mandatory vaccinations in schools is just one more reason not to go to the public school. The schools, you may not, there are a lot of things. We all talk about taxation, regulation, litigation. You know, this Whitney would probably mostly share the same views, but in the schools you can get numbers. And you can get numbers on how much the schools cost and how many students they have. Across the country, the average across the country in property taxes and taxes that go to the schools is $12,000 per student per 9 months. So that's $360,000 for every 30-student classroom for 9 months. Now, you could buy a good teacher and her retirement for $100,000 and probably rent a room for $20,000, and you've only used a third of the money. 2/3 of the money doesn't go to the classroom. It goes to the rest, the entire establishment of bureaucrats and special interests and things which are hanging on the educational system. And these people don't, they take the money and they don't have the good graces to take the money and go to Tahiti. They stay in the schools and make it hard for the teachers to teach. But only 1/3 of that money across the country is that way. In Washington, D.C., it is $500,000 per 30-student classroom, and most of the students graduate from the schools unable to read. Washington, D.C. schools are the only schools that are in the responsibility of the U.S. Congress. And Congress runs the D.C. schools. There are 50,000 students. 67% are black. Half the rest are Spanish American, and then there's others. So 35,000 black kids are scurrying about the streets of Washington, D.C., unable to read, while our congressmen preen about the streets in their fancy clothes and tell us lies. It's just an unbelievable situation. And of course, when the president's new education secretary went over and tried to give a nice speech at the D.C. public schools, they practically threw her out on her physically. The way it used to be, my mother and my uncle were both school teachers. My uncle came back from World War II, from the Navy, and went back to teaching school in rural Iowa. He taught a full load of classes, and they gave him a few bucks extra to be superintendent of schools. Those Iowa farmers were not going to pay for somebody who didn't teach. Today, 2/3 of the tax money across the country for the schools. You could double the salaries of the teachers, fire all the bureaucrats. I'm sure the teachers would be happy to do the administration for a doubled salary and have a lot of money left over and better schools. And that's your school districts. They're all going to be the same. It runs between $10,000 and $15,000 per student. And those are the numbers. So And in other things, it's harder to get numbers. See, medicine is, the medical costs have gone. Well, an example recently, we learned of a little CAT scanner. It's a foot CAT scanner. You put your foot on it, it does a CAT scan of your foot. And your foot is there for 48 seconds. That's after the 1 month wait while you get permission from the insurance company to have this important device look at your foot. Your foot's there for 48 seconds, does a CAT scan on your foot. Noah figured it out. Per unit time, it's more expensive to hire that foot CAT scanner than it is to hire a drilling rig in the Gulf of Mexico. It's not because of the device. It's because of this thing. The same thing has grown in medicine that has grown in education. You know, you have a cause and the government gets into it. Pretty soon the cause is just an excuse to collect money, and then they do crazy things with it. And the medical costs, now they're absorbing 20% of the GDP. Used to be 5%. Write your congressman. He's empowered them all, and his equivalent at the local and state level. But it's just incredible. Think about it. There are 35,000 black kids in D.C. cut off at the knees for life. They can't even read. Scurrying around under the feet of those congressmen. Both parties. Although the Democrats are generally a little worse. Oh, I'm sorry, yeah.
No problem. Art, I understand the Japanese feel similar to what you earlier mentioned. Postpone the vaccinations as long as possible.
Yeah.
I don't think, I'm not sure of this, but the first couple of years is, there's, what I'm trying to say is Japanese science isn't controlled by pharmaceuticals, in my view. And so if you have a study on the subject with one person, that would be an anecdotal result. Unless n equals 1, right? N equals 1. Unless n equals 1 is you, then you have a strong conviction. It's no longer anecdotal. And you try to observe, collect, think, what could it be? So I want to suggest, when I got Guillain-Barré syndrome after 3 weeks after 4 inoculations with thimerosal, what was I going to say? I forgot now. It's important. I had 20 mercury fillings in my mouth due to poor hygiene and eating candy and stuff. So I had a large dose before I got the shots of mercury. So I'm suggesting that we consider could it be dose dependent? Because that would separate me and all those mercury amalgam, but the mercury fillings, that would separate me from a lot of other people that get inoculated. So.
Well, the Japanese, if in a free country, customs may develop because they're useful. I don't know what the Japanese probably don't do that by law. They just perhaps have a custom. And in this country, that might have become the custom too if we didn't have a government telling us what to do. You know, civilizations and people, groups of people can gradually develop customs that are good for them. That's certainly a good custom.
And I think, until proven wrong, I'm still holding to its dose dependent.
Yeah. Well, this is Doctors for Disaster Preparedness. I stay away from doctors as far as I can. Because they're prepared for disaster, maybe. No, because I have a story I tell that I have a deal with my doctor that if he finds anything wrong with me, he's fired. And, but the truth is I don't have one. So I stay away from them as much as I possibly can. Yeah.
I know it's late, but I would be interested in some of your thoughts on Trump and how things are going, and particularly how you would say view the upcoming 2018
Yeah.
election, and then maybe secondary.
Yeah, I would love to, I'll tell you.
About Kavanaugh
Yeah.
and possibly.
So I work with my sons and daughters in research and in the things we do in our laboratory and our home. But on weekends, I'm going off in my car. Matthew fills it with Trump and Robinson signs, and I go out. I'll go to a fair, or a parade, or some other thing, and I come home with an empty car because I go out and mingle with the voters and talk with them, or maybe give speeches as that's scheduled. And so and we've done this the fifth time, so I kind of have a feeling for what the voters in Oregon are like. And grassroots Americans are good people, all of them. Almost all of them, Democrats, Republicans, across the board. Most people that I meet are people you'd be happy to have in your home for dinner. In Oregon, which is a liberal state, and they have 2/3 of the state house and the governor and so forth, because the city of Portland is quite liberal and controls the rest. But I'm mostly going around my district where except for 2 cities, I win all of that. But what I observe is that people are extremely energized for the president. I can tell you about it. How many people know what a tractor pull is? Oh, you all know. I guess I went to a tractor pull the other day, and in the middle of the place near the tractor pull, it was the Lane County Republicans that set up a nice tent, and there were a bunch of concessions, and nobody was paying attention. They were all lining the sides of the tractor pull, and went up and up and up, and then they had this thing. The last tractor that pulled was a 3-engine, 8,000 horsepower behemoth. After this thing had pulled, then people started walking around. They noticed the tent. And it was like suction. They just sucked up all the Trump signs. Everything we had, just whoosh. There's tremendous enthusiasm in the grassroots for the president. Everywhere I go, and I can sort of judge the parades. I'm in these parades, and that means the floats are going along, and you're walking in the side among the crowd, shaking hands with the people. And usually, I get a lot of nice people to shake hands, but I also get a lot of cat calls and this kind of stuff from the other guys. I didn't get any cat calls. In several parades, I only got 2 people that did this. The opposition was weaker. And I have an optimistic analysis of this, which may not be right. We'll find out next year. The president is at about 50%, right, in all these polls, which is good for a man at this point in his presidency. And of course, he's an unusual man. He speaks to the people in their own language, and I think he's just what we needed at this time. He's got 50%, but I think he has a lot more. The other 50%, the ones who are on, say, the other political side, they're ordinary Americans. They don't like profanity. They don't like lies. They don't like throwing garbage at the president for a year. And I think a certain fraction of them are mad. And I also don't think they're going to tell that to a pollster on the telephone. I think that there is a substantial depth in the people on the other side of the political spectrum of people who are going to vote for Trump or vote for candidates that he advocates in this election. Right now, I think there's only one candidate in the election. It's Donald Trump. Throughout Oregon, that's the only candidate. But they'll take Trump signs all over. They'll put up other signs, of other candidates. Each candidate has his warts and disadvantages. But I think he has the 50%, and I think he has a lot of the other 50%, enough to swing an election anyway, of people that just don't like this. What's been done in the last year and a half is not American, it's not even decent. It's unbelievable. And I think there's enough people mad about it. There's also a very substantial reservoir of people who don't want to get in trouble, they think, with their neighbors. So you're passing out yard signs, you got a stake with a sign on it, and those who don't take a Trump sign, but are kind of, obviously they would be on our side of the political spectrum, frequently say, I don't want to be seen with that in my yard. I don't want to have trouble with my neighbors. And I think a lot of people that are polled are thinking, I could tell somebody I don't know something that might reflect badly on me. So I think that this will be an unusual election. The unknown is the candidates, because each one of them, a lot of them are unprincipled politicians, and each race, of course, has its individual characteristics. But the issue in the election is Donald Trump, and I think he has a lot of support that isn't reflected in the polls. It doesn't mean that I think he's a man without sin or a man without idiosyncrasy. He's in some ways crazy, but he's crazy like the American people. He talks to us the way we talk to each other when we're drinking beer and watching a football game. Imagine a fact checker at one of those football games. It doesn't matter. And even my son Noah now, he's an incredible intellectual. He just signed up to Twitter. He wants to watch him direct instead of indirect through the news. But so CNN, if they're really good and get almost 1 million viewers, he's got 50 million people on his Twitter thing. It is. I'm not saying that he's the ideal president. I'm telling you, I think he was the ideal person at this time because he appeals to the grassroots in their language, in their way. You know, at that tractor pull, there are a lot of men with strong hands. You don't shake hands with people with dish rag handshakes at a tractor pull. And there are a lot of people like that across this country. And those people like what he's doing to improve things. Moreover, you know, the economy's gotten a lot better. You just asked me, so I'll talk about it. But the economy's gotten a lot better. Things are looking good. But there hasn't been time for the things he's done to make much effect, right? We just had the tax change, just had the tax cut, just had some regulations going down. He just got started. The things he's done couldn't have intrinsically caused this yet. What it's caused is tremendous optimism. The people see the direction has changed. I mean, U.S. Steel just said they were going to put $750 million into Gary, Indiana. Have any of you seen Gary, Indiana? If you go by on an Amtrak train through Gary, Indiana, it's mile after mile after mile of rusting steel mills. If you get off that train and go down the subdivisions, the houses are, I mean, I bet you could buy them for $100 a piece. They're just sitting there, destroyed hulks, subdivision after subdivision after subdivision. Gary, Indiana is totally destroyed. And U.S. Steel was going to put $750 million into it? I don't think that's because they've immediately figured out that they're going to make a profit for the next 10 years on that. It's optimism. And I think that it's clear. I think the decay has stopped. I don't know how far this man can turn it. He makes all kinds of mistakes, and I don't even know what the mistakes are, because what's a mistake in the swamp of Washington? You can't tell. You don't swim straight ahead. You probably swim backwards for a while before you swim forward. But he's changed. The country's becoming optimistic because the taxes and the regulations and all the things that have been oppressing American freedom, all the things that are making it so that we can't even compete with communists, for heaven's sakes, are starting to go away. And that optimism is, and you have, if you watch cycles in the markets, this market should have gone down. It's not going. Why? I think this optimism is everywhere because of this. Even though you have this man with idiosyncratic is probably not a good, we don't have a big enough word, okay? But it's happening. And I used to, DDP, you know, was born in civil defense. And we worked on civil defense. That's why Edward Teller always came. He was an advocate of civil defense, a very fine man. And when I worked on civil defense in those days during the Cold War, I studied American history more than I ever had before. And I noticed that at various times in American history, our country has been saved by what I came to call wildcards. Individuals, very strange individuals, unusual individuals who arose at specific times and at specific places just when our nation needed them. And I think that's what you're seeing again today.
These are two things that are tied together. The idea of multiple vaccinations in very young children.
Yeah.
And there was an article in AAPS, which I wish I remembered better, but it had to do with the anthrax vaccinations of soldiers in
Yeah.
one of our recent wars, and the fact that there were adjuvants and they were different soldiers got different batches,
Yeah.
and of course got not the PTSD but the Gulf War syndrome.
Well, there could be a factor. I think at Connie Chester, some of these lectures, you know, we had Dr. Hatfield and others. This lecture hall, some of you are old enough to remember this, but every year Connie Chester came. He was the director, the last director of the Civil Defense Research Program at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. That Civil Defense Program did the research upon which all the civil defense systems of the world are based, except for ours, because we don't have one. But in Switzerland, Russia, China, Scandinavia, they're based on this. These men tested shelters with real nuclear weapons. They did all kinds of things. So Connie Chester has spent his life in nuclear civil defense. The last several years that he came, he always spoke at our meetings, and the last several years that he came, he spoke about biological weapons, which he's feared far greater than nuclear weapons. In those days, the cost would be different today, but he said a couple of graduate students with access to the library and a couple $100,000 could kill 1 million people with anthrax. So there are terrible weapons of all sorts. Chemical weapons you heard about, they're almost the least because they only spread so far. The nuclear weapons, of course, are terrible, and the biological weapons are unbelievable because they're so cheap and easy to distribute. And the world's becoming a more dangerous place. And the president, I think, wants to make it less dangerous, but every time he tries to make it less dangerous, they make it more dangerous for him. I hope that he's successful because he definitely wants to try to get along with a lot of people who aren't very nice, but we have to live in the world with them. We can't have a nuclear war because we don't like them. So. I'm sorry I haven't given a very nice presentation with all these pictures, but this is a very unusual group. In fact, everybody in this room is idiosyncratic, I'm sure. I know most of you, and we have a wonderful time together, and I have a wonderful time watching it. And I think that we still have hope because we can still have these meetings, do anything we want or say anything we want, although they're watching us. My social credit, no, that's in China, the social credit score. Facebook calls it something different. It's probably not good and falling. Is anyone else would like to say or give a little speech of your own on something that interests you? No.
Is your margin over Fazio getting better?
Is what?
Your vote margin in the final Republican thing, for
You're talking about our election?
in the primary
Oh, the primary.
in Oregon.
Oh, the primary in Oregon, well, I think we spent $500 campaigning and beat 4 other contestants. So it's not, doesn't they, huh?
Are you getting the margin below Fazio better?
All the indications are better. We will do better. Whether we will do enough better, nobody knows. There's quantitative ways of knowing that we're better. We have only one problem in Oregon today, and that's our governor candidate, because we have a bunch of leftist Republicans, and they didn't want to see the leftist governor overturned, so they gave him $3 million to win the primary, so we wouldn't have a conservative in the race. That's too bad, but DeFazio, when we ran, we know nothing about politics. We shouldn't. It's his fault because we went. Noah and Matthew and I went down to see a town hall meeting by our congressman, and I don't think I even knew his name. But we came back shaking our heads, saying, "That's awful. That's our congressman. That's really terrible." And then we learned that the mayor of Springfield was running against him. So we said, well, that's fine. I hope he can beat him, you know. And then 3 days before the filing date, Matthew calls me from graduate school and says, "Dad, did you know the mayor of Springfield dropped out?" So we had this meeting, the three of us, and we decided that we'd run against him, and now we know more about politics than we ever wanted to know. And then we went along with this, and then one time they asked me to go to a meeting of the state party, a state convention, and they needed a non-voting delegate from our county. So I go up, and I'm sitting in the back of the hall, and I have no vote, but I'm watching. And the miscreants in the state party had made it so hard on the state chair that she resigned. So they had an election, somebody nominated me, and then I was the state chairman. Then I learned even more about politics that I didn't want to know. But as I said, we're all of us trying to save a constitutional republic on a democratic playing field. The founders knew about this. 10 years after the revolution, they convened in convention largely because they were afraid America would become a democracy. And they knew the democracies had all failed. The 51% could vote away the fundamental rights of everyone. And they wanted to prevent that. So they delineated our fundamental rights, and they built a structure that they hoped would protect them. And they bequeathed us to us, and they were guardedly optimistic if you read the things they wrote. And George Washington said, well, the experiment is up to the American people. This isn't the exact words, but the experiment's up to the American people. I don't know how they'll do, but this opportunity may never come again. So now we are in what they anticipated, trying to save our constitutional republic on a democratic battlefield with a people that has been taught that they live in a democracy and can vote away anything that they can get 51% for. And yet, that's the only battlefield we're offered, so we have to stand and win on that. That, in my opinion, is what's going on. We're all in that fight. Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, the word democracy does not exist in the Declaration of Independence nor in the Constitution.
Oh, yes. No, the word doesn't. Well, no, it appears in the writings of the Founding Fathers frequently. They were against it. If 51% can vote away the fundamental rights of the 49, pretty soon it's just chaos. And of course, the press, the media, has gone crazy because they felt that it was their privilege to tell the mob what to do and to get the 51% to vote their way. An election occurred when the mob didn't pay attention to them. And they are just beside themselves, not only because of their political position, but because we didn't pay attention. It was their privilege to determine the elections, they thought. You're in danger of a political speech. So I better quit. Anyone else want to say anything? Huh?
Go for it.
No, that's you want to do that. What?
When you win,
Yeah.
can we count on you to help us save? I'm from Northern California. My parents' ranch is just below the Klamath River.
Yeah.
And there's the largest dam destruction project in worldwide history is on the Klamath River for hydroelectric, clean, green, renewable
Yeah, well.
dams. Can we count on you to help us save our hydroelectric facilities? My dad.
Well, I've writing access to energy for 25 years. Obviously, I'm a fan of hydroelectric power. Its only disadvantage is there aren't enough sites to provide all our energy. It's a wonderful form of power. Although, you know, the Palo Verde nuclear power station sitting outside Phoenix has 3 reactors. Each produces twice the power of Hoover Dam. Nuclear power is the future. You've had many speakers here that have talked about that. And that's a big problem now because it's shifting east. The Chinese, the Russians, India, almost all the nuclear power plants to be built in the next 50 years are being built in the east. When their power costs 2 cents a kilowatt hour and ours costs 12 or 15, then our heavy industry is gone. It's but I love dams and hydroelectric projects. So. Yeah, I understand. I know, because that's close to home. I'm simply a candidate in favor of freedom and liberty. And I think the Constitution's a perfect balance for that, and we need to return to the use of it. All our congressmen are sworn to it every 2 years, and they ignore it. And it's, but obvious, I don't know the details about that project, but if it's a hydroelectric dam and it's being interfered with the bureaucrats, I'm 99% sure of what I would do. Very, very few of our congressmen do these things. I had a guy came up to the Republican booth. He was a Democrat. He started yelling at me in the fair. And so he asked me a question, I answered. And he asked me another question, I answered. He says, am I in the right booth? He says, you're a libertarian. He says, the political wing that I represent is pure constitutional republic. And anybody could build a dam anywhere that they don't take property away from someone without compensation to build. It's what the American people were able to do after the Founding Fathers gave us that freedom was unparalleled in human history. We can do it again. All we have to do is get the government off our backs. And we have a man in office who knows something about that, and he's doing his best. He's not a reality TV star. He's a guy who built buildings in New York City. Do you have any idea what the environment is like, getting thousands of people to build a building in New York City? There isn't a politician in the country that can go up against that kind of experience. And I don't think he walks on water. It's wonderful to see a man that has our nation at heart there and ruling in the way he has. And of course, I'm running for office, so I promise anything, right? It isn't true, but that's the way it's done.
Give us our page.
Huh? What?
Remember the ad?
What?
Promise her anything, but give her our page.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the system is corrupt, and it isn't just corrupt. It's corrupt nationally, it's corrupt locally, it's corrupt at the state level, it's corrupt at the party level, it's corrupt everywhere. But what isn't corrupt are grassroots Americans. They don't know a lot. They've been easily misled in a lot of ways, but I think, I don't have a way to derive the number, but I bet 95% of the people you meet on the street you'd be happy to have in your home for dinner. And you could discuss politics with them and get along. But of course, the politicians want us all to fight with each other and polarize us to their benefit.
Art, I probably talk to 10,000 people a year in Middle America, and I just echo just what you say. I just find people fabulous.
Mm-hmm.
And they just divorce themselves from all the corruption and live their lives and let it blow over. And the only problem we face, will they come out of the fold in November? I think they will, but...
Matthew did his own little test. He decided he was going to run against DeFazio. So he switched parties to the Democrat Party and ran against DeFazio in his own primary. The guy just went crazy. Every vote was a black eye. And Matthew did very well. He raised enough money for one flyer, and our county got 20% of the Democrats. Overall, I think he got 12 or 13. He changed back. He wrote one flyer. Ron Paul could have written it. It was, and went at him and did very well. DeFazio ran flyer after flyer, but and that's why I think those grassroots people are opposed to what they've been seeing the last year.
I think to see what we've been facing in perspective, be sure to see D'Souza's Death of Nations.
Mm-hmm.
That film is absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah.
The critics gave it a 0 rating out of 100.
Mm-hmm.
All critics gave it 0.
Yeah.
If you go to the Rotten Tomatoes website, you look at the people who've seen the movie's rating,
Mm-hmm.
90 out of 100.
Yeah.
Something like 700 ratings.
Yeah.
90 out of 100. death of a nation
Yeah.
is a must-see. And you can take people who do not have their eyes open to see that film, and it can enlighten them.
Yeah, I'm sure it's wonderful. I haven't seen it yet, but I know who the man is. He's fantastic, so I'm sure the movie is fantastic. Yeah.
The language of us, people, and it explains what's going on in America.
Yeah.
It's called the death of a nation.
Yeah. Anyway, my estimation is that they're going to win, that the Republicans are going to win. I think the only thing that screw it up is the Republican politicians.
That's comforting to say. I do think that there are a lot of people
Yeah.
that really don't have their eyes open. I think it's necessary to educate those people. I mean, in this room, you don't have to worry. Our eyes are open to what's going on. That's not true outside of this room.
Everybody in this room is different, and they all think. If I had to give a real political speech before the people in this room, I'd be scared. and not because of what party they might happen to be in. Everybody here can think for himself. And that you better not make mistakes, and they'll have all kinds of different views, which is the way the whole American nation is supposed to be. Okay. Thank you for coming. Thank Jane Orient. This organization, Jane, it's about 30 years ago, I think, somebody donated $40,000 to DDP. She has used that capital to run all these meetings all these years.